Let's just read verse 20 and 21 together. And in verse 20 and 21, the Apostle Paul says, "Thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I built on someone else's foundation, but as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand." So what is Paul's ambition? What is it that drives him? What is his aspiration? Simply this, that he will preach the gospel. He wants to proclaim the good news. For that is what the word preach means. It's a proclamation. Paul wants to declare the glad tidings from the rooftops for everyone that will listen and for everyone that will believe. Paul does not simply want to lecture people to sleep. Nor does Paul want to entertain people so that he retains their attention, but only because he's entertaining them. And he doesn't want to tell them little happy stories that make people feel good about themselves. No, the Apostle Paul wants to preach. And he wants to preach the gospel of Christ. And Paul wants to preach the never-changing, the eternal, the divine message of God to every generation. He wants to preach Christ and Christ crucified. He wants to preach of Christ's life and all that Christ taught and all that Christ did. He wants to preach of Christ's death upon the cross and his resurrection from the tomb. And he wants to preach about Christ's glorious ascension into the clouds and into heaven. He wants to preach about Christ's present reign next to his Father's side in glory. And he wants to preach of the wonderful promise that Christ is returning, that Christ is coming again. And where does the Apostle Paul want to preach that message? To whom does Paul want to preach the message? He says, to all those who have not yet heard of him. He wants to preach to everyone, to all the nations of the world, because that's the command of Christ, isn't it? Do you remember the command of Christ at the end of Matthew's gospel before he ascends into heaven? He says, now go, therefore, go into all the world. Proclaim the gospel, make disciples of every nation, and teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. And then Jesus says, and remember, I'll be with you always. Now do this to the very end of the age. That should be our ambition as a church. This should be our holy ambition, that we might preach the gospel to those who have not yet heard of Jesus. Now, does this mean that we pack our bags and head off into the deepest rainforest and find some tribe that has not yet heard of Jesus? Well, for some people, perhaps. If God has called you to that particular calling, well, then that might be precisely what God wants from you. But we don't have to pack our bags. We don't have to head overseas to reach people who have never really heard of Christ. They're in our offices. We work with them. They're in our families. They're on our streets. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. They're in schools and in the universities of this city. There are people throughout this city who have never really heard of Jesus. Not really. They might have heard the name. They might have a vague notion, but they've never really heard the gospel. And so that's why we as a church and why many members of this church support open-air preaching in the city, that we might preach Jesus to those who have not yet heard of him. And that's why other members of the church will give away free Bibles out on the high streets, because we want to make Jesus known to those who have not yet heard of him. That's why we upload our sermons out onto the internet and spread them far and wide, because we want to reach people who have not yet heard of Jesus. And that's why we speak to our friends, to our families, to our colleagues, to our classmates. For we want to make Jesus known amongst those who have never really heard of him. Now let that be our holy ambition, to preach the gospel of Christ to those who have not seen and not heard. Is this your holy ambition? Is this your desire? Is this what you are aspiring to? The Apostle Paul is showing us If we have ambition, let our ambition be this, that we will proclaim the gospel of Christ.